Can I tell you about my latest obsession? I cannot get enough of this pumpkin picking candle from Wisco Home Goods. The second I light it, I'm transported to all the things I love about fall. Crisp apple in the air, warm spices, a hint of hayride magic. It's like I'm walking through my favorite orchard, sipping cider, or rustling through a pumpkin patch. It's fall in a jar. And the best part, it's clean burning soy made right here in Madison. Seriously, if autumn had a scent, this is it. Get yours today. You can grab one in-store on Madison's East Side or online at wiscohomegoods.com. You're going to the Wisconsin Book Festival's fall celebration, right? It's our state's premier literary event of the year, and it's less than 2 weeks away. It's October 23rd through the 26th, so get planning and get reading, and we'll see you there. It's a public opportunity with more than 55 events where you can connect with authors and fellow book lovers at Madison Central Library and other downtown venues. It's accessible to everyone, and yes, there are even sometimes free book giveaways with signed copies available from renowned authors. Don't forget, the festival also hosts author programming all year round. So what are you waiting for? Go find the complete schedule at wisconsinbookfestival.org. This is CityCast Madison. I'm Bianca Martin, and here's what Madison's talking about.
If there's one thing Madisonians love, it's a good protest. And this weekend, thousands of people are expected to descend on the Capitol for the No Kings protest, a national campaign against the policies and presidency of Donald Trump. But in today's era of mass surveillance, it's more important than ever to know your rights before heading off to a rally. I'm executive producer Haley Sperling, sitting in for your host, Bianca Martin. And today, we're bringing back my conversation with Ryan Cox, legal director of the ACLU of Wisconsin, so you can get in the know before you go. Let's dive in. Ryan, welcome to CityCast Madison. We're so happy to have you on the show.
Yeah, thanks, Haley. Happy to be here.
Of course. So, we're lucky because we get to talk about all the issues, and whatever issue piques our interest, we get to protest about it, right? So I want to back up a little bit and talk about the act of protesting itself. Most of the time people are using their First Amendment rights when they go protest. And so when it comes to freedom of expression and gathering, what exactly are the rights that we hold as protesters and as U.S. citizens?
Yeah, I think this is something that the ACLU of Wisconsin is constantly looking at, working on, looking to expand. But, the First Amendment of the United States Constitution, as well as our Wisconsin Constitution, guarantees the right to both freedom of speech, freedom of assembly. And these are things that, have been challenged for decades and decades as individual organizers and protesters march on the streets and, regularly come under attack. And at the ACLU of Wisconsin, we think it's one of our core mission areas to work in and out of the courts, at the legislature, to try to protect these rights, expand the options for people to peacefully demonstrate, to express their opinions, their dissent to governmental actions. And, so there are certain cases and laws that have been enacted that, really make it clear that these rights cannot be infringed upon. So the first thing I think that folks are interested to know is that there is no requirements to have permits from your city or county if you are demonstrating or protesting in response to breaking news. As long as you're not blocking roadways and things, this is completely legal without any kind of permitting process. There's also a lot of freedoms that go along with that, which is generally the ability to use amplified speech if you have certain equipment that you want to use, as long as there's not public safety issues involved. And certainly the ability to engage in this activity in anywhere that is traditionally a public forum, which includes sidewalks, streets to the extent that you're not blocking traffic, public parks, the steps of the Capitol, the plazas in front of your federal courthouse. All of these areas are traditional areas for public demonstration, and the strongest First Amendment protections exist in these spaces. So, often what people are thinking about in terms of, what are your rights to protest is really what are your rights in dealing with police. If there are perhaps, instances where a particular city or the federal government or someone is intending to encroach upon your First Amendment rights, it's usually interactions with police. And so, it's a completely different set of rights that are much broader in how you deal with police in these situations. But, for the most part, First Amendment rights are extremely broad, very well protected, and, we hope everybody takes advantage of them.
Yeah, for sure. And I definitely want to dig into that police bit. We're going to circle back to that. But you mentioned streets, you mentioned public plazas. Are there places where people can't protest? Places where you can say you actually do need a permit or you're not allowed to be here?
Yeah. So, any private property, certainly the owners of that property can restrict what actions can happen on that property. So these things might include things that are generally open to the public, but are still privately owned. So say, for example, like museums or, maybe shopping malls, things like that. When these are privately owned property, the owners of that have the ability to restrict what happens on there, and people can be trespassed for being there. There's also kind of what's like quasi-public property. So like a university campus is a good example of this.
We got those.
That's right. All across the state. Technically, these are government-owned properties, but they do have the ability to do what's called time, place, and manner restrictions for these kinds of not as traditional public spaces like, the courthouse steps or something. So time, place, and manner restrictions mean that something like, the University of Wisconsin can issue rules that say, we're not going to allow demonstrations like after 10 p.m. or we're not going to allow them on the public roads in the university. And as long as those things are content neutral, so they don't have anything to do with what the actual demonstration is about, then those are generally permissible restrictions in these quasi-public spaces. And so some examples of things that are not content neutral, if they said, we're not going to allow demonstrations on this particular issue, or we're not going to allow demonstrations that include like a specific country's flag, for example. Those things are not content neutral, and those would not pass scrutiny under the First Amendment if they were challenged in court. So it's really clear, we see this also on campuses, not related to protests, but even just the ability for organizations, individual student organizations, to just do their regular activities. If those organizations are being banned because of the thing that they're wanting to meet about or talk about or demonstrate about, then those are also not content neutral. And so there's a big distinction in those spaces.
Interesting. So the universities, for example, they'd have the right to sort of regulate and say, you can't necessarily be on our property, but they can't say you can't talk about XYZ here because we don't want you to. It has to do more so with the logistics of it all rather than the content of what's being said.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And, there's some issues over the past couple of years with demonstrations all across the country at public universities where maybe individuals were trying to set up encampments, and the university setting up regulations about, how you can protest, whether folks are allowed to set up an encampment during certain periods of time. I think it's really interesting when protesters explain that the encampment itself is actually core to the speech.
Right.
For example, if you're trying to protest the fact that people across the world are being forced to live in encampments like that, it actually becomes part of the speech. And then restrictions on that are no longer content neutral. So it's a very interesting kind of dichotomy about what schools are allowed to do, to regulate their university, allow classes to go on as normal, protect public safety, all of those things that they're allowed to do, but not, overstep that line to regulate what speech is allowed.
I know that the ACLU and other legal entities, they typically come out to observe protests and make sure that no one's rights are being violated. So I'm curious to that extent, what are some of the most common things that your observers see at protests?
Yeah, so historically, the ACLU of Wisconsin has had a pretty robust legal observer program, mostly run by volunteers who had received individual training. The ACLU of Wisconsin has lately been phasing that out for various safety reasons of volunteers. But nevertheless, historically we've done this, and many of our members, employees, volunteers, still do legal observing with other groups, such as the National Lawyers Guild, who still does significant legal observing programs across the state. And, some of the things that they're really looking out for when they're doing legal observing is, number one, trying to just create a record. If individual police encounters happen, getting photos and video of those encounters so that they might be able to be used later on to enforce rights for the future. Also, essentially looking for like de-escalation opportunities, trying to prevent folks from doing things that, might get them potentially into an encounter with the police. And, generally being able to advise folks about their rights in police encounters. Those are the main things. So being able to tell people, even if it's yelling across the street, that you don't have to answer questions from the police. Things like that are, part of the training. But it's right there in the name, though. Most legal observers, it's observing. It's trying to create records that will assist, like civil rights lawyers and individual people involved later down the line, and not so much intervention.
Mm-hmm. And so let's say you do get stopped by police at a protest. What do you do?
Yeah, I think the most important thing is to remain calm and not escalate the situation. I think many people are inclined to try to enforce their rights in the moment, when usually those rights are only enforced by a court after the fact. And so, understanding that you telling police officers that your rights is perhaps not going to help the situation, is not going to prevent them from potentially doing an arrest or doing some kind of other enforcement action. So, understanding that while you're enforcing your rights, it may not prevent, actual adverse action happening in the moment. So number one, being calm and understanding that fact is just reality. But nevertheless, being clear that you're plan to enforce your rights, which are, not answering questions if you do not want to answer questions. If you're being detained and there's no indication that you're under arrest or that you're being suspected of a crime, if you're just randomly being detained, you don't have to identify yourself. At the point that you are under arrest in Wisconsin, you do have to produce an ID, but after that, you do not have to answer any other questions whatsoever. We always say, shut the F up and ask for your lawyer. And then at that point, there should be no further interrogation of you, and that will put you in the best situation moving forward. In addition, everyone always has the right to refuse consent to a search. And that includes your person, your vehicle, your home, but that doesn't mean one won't happen. So I think, again, to the original point, making it clear verbally that I do not consent to any searches or seizures of my person is very important to have that on the record. Hopefully it'll be on body cam, but you may very well be searched anyway. And then it's your job to enforce those rights after the fact by having either, any charges or citations thrown out, potentially even, depending on the severity of the situation, damages against police department for violating your rights. But we just want to be clear, I think, that enforcing your rights means like making it clear that you don't consent to any of this, and it's essentially being done to you without your consent, and then, letting the police still carry out their actions. This is the way that folks are able to proceed safely and not have any, violence inflicted upon them by the state.
All right. So stay calm, call a lawyer if you need to, and do not consent to searches. That's what we're getting here.
Those are the main points for sure.
Remember that weird sound your furnace made last winter? The one you hoped wouldn't get worse? Hope's not a great heating strategy. Not in Wisconsin. By December, the phones ring nonstop, everyone's furnace decides to quit at the same time, emergency calls, big repair bills, long wait lists, all when your family needs heat most. Right now, Cardinal Heating is offering $1,000 off a new furnace and AC system, but only until October 31st. And there's up to $2,600 in federal rebates and tax credits you could qualify for, but those expire at the end of 2025. This isn't just a deal, it's peace of mind. When it's 5 degrees outside, you'll be warm and relaxed because you took care of it now. Visit cardinalservice.com and schedule your free estimate. The last good deal of the year is right now, before the cold, before the panic, before prices rise. It was a dark and stormy night, and you were caught on Hallows Eve without a costume. The horror! Are you ready for Halloween? You could buy something new, but why would you when you could get something spectacular and unique at a low cost at your local St. Vinny's? St. Vincent de Paul, Madison has it all. Halloween accessories, wigs, shoes, and more for your DIY costume. They've got Halloween costumes for the whole family, including kids and pets. And speaking from personal experience, I found incredible sequenced dresses, bespoke blazers, and dramatic fashion accents for costumes there. St. Vinny's is my go-to for finding an outfit item that's kind of tricky that I don't have for my costume. Plus, if you need any Halloween yard decorations, perhaps you have to haunt up a haunted house, they got you. By the way, while you're there, why not get a jumpstart on your holiday shopping? St. Vinny's gift cards make for the perfect present for any occasion. Go secure your costume. Head on over to Madison St. Vinny's today. Explore the wonders of science at the 15th Annual Wisconsin Science Festival, October 16th through the 26th. With over 200 events happening in more than 55 counties throughout Wisconsin, this statewide celebration brings science, technology, and art to all ages. It's a jam-packed 10 days of learning, ranging from interactive experiments to thought-provoking panels to the fusion of art and science. It kicks off on October 16th with the fan favorite, Science on the Square. On October 17th, it's time for laughs, where you can join for Sci-Prov, where science meets improv comedy. And if you like great shows, on October 21st, head to the Majestic Theater for the Y-Sci Variety Show for a fast-paced, fun-filled night of nerdy flash talks mixed with artful performance. And on Saturday, October 25th, be sure to check out the UW-Madison Campus Open House. Plus, throughout the Wisconsin Science Fest, you'll be able to join for their signature events like Crossroads of Ideas, Soundwaves, and Wisconsin Book Festival author events. There's truly something for everyone in every corner of Wisconsin. For more event details, visit wiscifest.org.
So I want to take a second, too, to talk about safety precautions that folks should take into consideration when attending these protests. Not to be a fearmonger about this, but just because it's the reality of the world that we live in. And so I'm curious to get your perspective. What are some of the biggest safety precautions that folks should consider before attending a protest?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, we generally advise folks that you should definitely have a plan about how long and where you intend to be, and make sure that someone you trust knows those things, so that if you're not back at a certain time, they know that maybe they should worry about where you are and try to figure out where you are. So number one, having a plan and making that clear to someone who you trust. The second thing is making sure that you have the phone numbers. If something were to happen and you were to be, perhaps arrested for whatever reason, whether justified or not, I think many people today don't know phone numbers that they could call once they're in custody. And so making sure you have a phone number, whether that's somebody who can come and pick you up, or it's an attorney who you intend to talk to. I mean, those are some basic things, but having that available. If you can't memorize it, then a lot of folks who are organizing will just write it in Sharpie on their arm. That way they know they're going to have it no matter what, if their phone is confiscated or anything like that. So just being prepared for like those kind of worst case scenarios, hoping that they never happen. But then on top of that, something else that we are really concerned about at the ACLU is just the mass surveillance state that is growing and growing. And so, I think folks need to be aware that at many demonstrations, there are likely to be surveillance activities, license plate readers, facial recognition, things happening depending on which law enforcement is there and where you are. And there are steps that can be taken to prevent that. Folks that I trust generally say, they put their cell phones on airplane mode or don't bring them at all. Many people choose to, cover their face, take public transportation, things like that make it harder to track movements and who is where. If for some reason, just mere attendance might be weaponized against you. So, we've certainly seen across the country situations like this where demonstrators and protesters are being targeted criminally or under immigration rules for their specific speech and involvement in particular kinds of protests. And so it's a real threat. And so it's something to take seriously. And, at the ACLU of Wisconsin, I think we're working with city councils and hopefully eventually with the legislature to try to put some limitations and some guardrails on these things so that they're not abused against Wisconsinites all over the state. But nevertheless, it's something to be concerned about.
Yeah. And so you've mentioned a couple of reasons already, but I would love to dig a little bit deeper into this surveillance and why is it something that folks should keep in mind in the first place when they are heading out to a protest or just kind of in general in our daily lives, because we are kind of being surveilled all the time. Again, not to be conspiratorial about anything. It's just the fact of the matter, right?
No, we definitely are all the time. And companies that, like that are private companies doing this type of surveillance, we know for sure. They then turn around and sell this information to government agencies, law enforcement agencies for profit. And so, the Madison Police Department doesn't even have to do this type of surveillance. They can just buy it from FedEx or from the Brewers or whoever they want. And so, it's really important, I think, just to be aware that these things are going on and available and, to law enforcement if there were to be an effort to weaponize these things. And then, once local police departments have them, it's certainly possible for the federal government then to require that information to be filtered up for whatever purposes, a particular administration might seek to use them for. So, generally the First Amendment includes a right to, be anonymous as well. And so taking advantage of those things will be more important for some people who are maybe more at risk than others. And it's up to individual people, I think, to decide their level of risk tolerance in being personally associated with whatever it is that they're demonstrating for or protesting against.
Yeah, for sure. So it's really just coming down to that personal motives and if you're okay with that. And though with that in mind, though, you can't always control the actions of other people in the crowd. I'm sure no one wants to accidentally dox their fellow protesters. So what are some of those best practices when it comes to getting those images while keeping people safe at protests?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, Haley. And I think, one thing that people should consider is whether they want to be live streaming things versus taking the content locally and then being able to make informed decisions after the fact about what to share, like whether that includes, maybe you shouldn't include things that include people's individual faces or minors or, particular acts of violence that might happen even from police departments or whatever. And so understanding, if you can wait a bit, use discretion about what you're sharing out publicly, maybe that's a better option. Now, in some cases, like if there's a risk of your equipment being confiscated, people might make the decision that it's better to live stream that or get it into the cloud where it can't be confiscated nearly as easily. So, it really depends on the circumstances, and it depends on kind of what type of activities are going on, and what if you're, maybe a blogger or maybe you're a podcaster and you want to, you're looking for content for a show, that's a little bit different than a regular person who's out there and just films something randomly. And so I think it's a really good question to be aware of these things and make sure, that you're not also going to be looped into anything just because you were there recording it as well.
Sure. I mean, at the end of the day, too, it really comes back to safety. And, we've covered a lot here. There is so much to keep in mind when it comes out to protesting. And of course, Madison loves a protest. Is there anything else that folks should keep in mind before hitting the streets for the next event?
The most important thing, of course, is your individual safety. At the ACLU of Wisconsin, we certainly don't engage or encourage any kind of specific civil disobedience, but certainly peaceful resistance is core to the 100-year history of the ACLU. And so we want to make sure that people are able to go out and protest and demonstrate and express their voices and opinions in peaceful ways. And that can only be done if everybody takes their own safety seriously, takes steps before going out to make sure that they're prepared in case anything does happen and that they have a plan. If they might just be standing next to a person who's a provocateur or, engaging in something that they're not interested in engaging in. And so taking that safety really seriously and having a plan is always the best way. And we hope more people get out there and express their opinions.
Well, Ryan, thank you so much for your time and all of this useful information. It has been incredibly insightful, and now we know for the next time.
Thanks, Haley. Appreciate it.
That's Ryan Cox, legal director of the ACLU of Wisconsin. The No Kings protest will take place this Saturday, October 18th. Protesters are expected to gather at McPike Park at 2 p.m. and then march to the Capitol for a rally at 3 p.m. That's all for today here on CityCast Madison. I'm executive producer Haley Sperling, sitting in for your host, Bianca Martin. Don't forget, you can support this show and get great perks by becoming a CityCast Madison neighbor. All you got to do is head to membership.citycast.fm. And if you enjoyed today's show, why not share this episode with someone who knows their rights and fights for them? We'll be back tomorrow morning with more stories from around the city. Until then, take care.